The doors swung open, and silence crashed down on Bloodspike Bar like a guillotine. Every merc, bounty hunter, and warlord in the room turned to stare at the human who had just walked in. Isaac Vale didn't acknowledge them. He moved like a man who had nothing to prove, who had seen worse things than anything in this room could throw at him. His combat vest was unzipped, cargo pants torn and dust-stained, boots heavy with dried blood. No armor. No visible weapons. He didn't need them. He stepped toward the bar. The floor creaked under his weight. The bartender, a click-tar, for arms and nervous eyes, hesitated, glancing toward the throne at the back of the room. The warlord of Bloodspike, Korzak, leaned back in his chair, a hulking brute of chitin plates and clawed hands, watching with the lazy amusement of a predator who had never met an equal. One of his hands gripped the head of a smaller alien, shoving it toward the ground. The creature whimpered as a pack of Vrask hounds circled, their cybernetic jaws dripping acidic saliva, waiting for their master's order. Isaac didn't look. He rapped his knuckles on the counter. Whiskey. Neat. The bartender didn't move. A slow, grating chuckle rumbled from Korzak's throat. You lost, Deathworlder? His 6 crimson eyes glowed under the bar's dim lighting, fixing on Isaac with a look that could melt lesser men into submission. Isaac exhaled through his nose. He didn't answer. The bartender's hands trembled as he poured the drink. Isaac picked it up, took a slow sip, and set the glass down. Korzak clicked his mandibles. No words, little ape? You must not know where you are. He tightened his grip on the alien's skull, forcing its face closer to the snapping hounds. I own this bar. I own this city. And I don't like off-world scum drinking at my counter. Isaac took another sip. The room was a pressure chamber, seconds from bursting. Dozens of killers sat frozen, waiting to see if the human would beg, fight, or die. Then, he stood up. Isaac didn't say a word. Didn't look at Korzak. He simply turned toward the door. A low growl rumbled through the room. A slow, seething insult. Korzak stood, all 10 feet of him, and his shadow swallowed Isaac whole. I asked you a question, Deathworlder. The floor vibrated as he took a step forward. The Vrask hounds snapped and snarled. You either answer, he lunged. A plasma-forged blade extended from his wrist, flashing toward Isaac's spine. Isaac moved. To the watching aliens, he disappeared. The next thing anyone saw was Korzak's wrist caught mid-swing, frozen in Isaac's grip. For the first time in his life, the warlord felt pain. Isaac squeezed. Chitin cracked. Korzak roared in agony, dropping to a knee as Isaac twisted his arm, the blade clattering uselessly to the floor. The entire bar sucked in a breath. No one had ever seen Korzak kneel. Isaac's voice was quiet, like the calm before an execution. I was just leaving. Korzak snarled and swung his other clawed hand. Isaac let go of his wrist and stepped inside the blow. One strike. His knee drove up into the warlord's midsection. Exoskeleton crunched. Korzak lurched forward, choking on his own breath. Isaac caught the back of his skull and slammed it down. The bar counter shattered. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. Glasses fell, tables shook, the Vrask hounds yelped and backed away. Korzak's head was embedded in the broken wood, unmoving. A long, horrified silence followed. Isaac stepped back, dusted off his hands, and let out a slow, disappointed sigh. Another ruined drink. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. Someone stood. A mercenary with cybernetic arms, face scarred from 1,000 battles, reaching for his gun. Then another stood. The bar erupted. Isaac didn't hesitate. A vibromachete flashed toward his throat. He snatched it mid-air, spun it, and buried it in the merc's gut. Another lunge from behind, Isaac grabbed the dying body, hurled it forward, and crushed 2 more under the weight. A plasma rifle fired, Isaac ducked, rolled forward, yanked the gun from the shooter's claws, and turned it against him. Bodies dropped. A cybernetic war beast charged. Isaac sidestepped, grabbed a severed limb, and caved its skull in with a single swing. The fight was over before it started. Seconds passed. The only ones left standing were Isaac and the survivors too terrified to move. A man kneeled. Then another. A chain reaction of submission. A scarred lieutenant, his face soaked in blood, looked up at Isaac and spoke with something between fear and reverence. "Warlord," his voice shook. "What are your orders?" Isaac stared at the room, corpses, blood, shattered glass. The bartender, still trembling, held up another glass of whiskey. He sighed. Isaac grabbed the dead warlord's chair, sat down, and took the drink. "First order?" He took a sip, rolled the whiskey across his tongue. Then, he smirked. "Someone get me a damn cigar." The weight of silence hung in the air, heavy as death. The bodies lay where they had fallen, broken, bleeding, discarded like scraps from a butcher's table. The survivors knelt, eyes locked on the human who now sat on the dead warlord's throne, whiskey in one hand, the room's fate in the other. Isaac took a slow sip, savoring the burn. It tasted like victory. Like inevitability. "Warlord," the lieutenant rasped, voice hoarse with the weight of what had just transpired. "Your orders." Isaac set the glass down on the cracked counter. His gaze swept the room, taking stock of the survivors. Korzak's top lieutenants knelt among them. Hardened killers. Now leaderless. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrests of his newly claimed throne. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," he said, voice steady, controlled. "I came for a drink." He gestured to the carnage. "And now look at this mess." No one dared breathe. Isaac's eyes locked on Tarashek, the scarred lieutenant who had spoken first. He had the look of a soldier, not just a thug, one who had seen war, bled for it, survived it. "You," Isaac said. Rashek stiffened. "You worked for Korzak." Rashek nodded once. "I did." Isaac tilted his head, measuring him. "You loyal to him, or his seat?" Rashek hesitated. The wrong answer meant death. "I was loyal to strength," he said finally. Korzak had it. Until now. Isaac smiled, slow and sharp. "Good answer." He leaned back. "Then tell me, what happens next?" Rashek swallowed hard. Korzak controlled the Iron Fawn Legion. His death leaves a power vacuum. The other warlords, Vorik, Shakar, and Jekson, will move to claim his territory. His gaze flicked to the others kneeling. They'll send assassins. Challenges. Armies. They'll test you. If you survive, they'll come themselves. Isaac nodded as if this was expected. "How long?" Rashek exhaled. "Assassins? Before sunrise. The others? Within the week." Isaac tapped a finger against his glass. "How many men does the Iron Fawn Legion have?" Rashek hesitated. 2,000. Isaac raised an eyebrow. "And how many are actually here?" The lieutenant grimaced. "Most are stationed across the sector. Only about 200 are in the city." Isaac chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, that's inconvenient." He sighed, then stood, rolling his shoulders. The room stiffened, hands twitching toward weapons, but Isaac just picked up a fallen plasma rifle and checked the power cell. "I need 50 of your best men," he said. "Armed, ready to kill." Rashek frowned. "For what?" Isaac chambered the rifle, the hum of plasma charging filling the silence. "We're going to send a message." The first assassin came within 4 hours. Isaac was waiting. The sniper had been good, a Nabari, cloaked in optical camo, breathing slow, patient. He had positioned himself on a rooftop across from Bloodspike Bar, lined up the shot, squeezed the trigger. And the bullet never landed. Isaac moved before the plasma round left the barrel. In a blink, he was outside, rifle raised, eyes locked on the faint shimmer of the assassin's cloaking field. The sniper's mistake was breathing. Isaac heard it. and fired. The plasma round burned through flesh. A gurgling scream followed. Isaac stood over the body as the field flickered and died, revealing a blue-skinned corpse with a hole through its throat. He kicked the rifle away, then looked up at the rest of the city. They had seen. They were watching. Isaac grabbed the dead sniper by the collar, hauled him up like a trophy, and threw the body over the edge of the roof. It landed in the middle of the street, for all to see. The message was clear. Try again. The second attack was louder. 2 speeders full of mercenaries rushed the bar at dawn, thinking they'd catch him sleeping. Explosives, heavy weaponry, the works. Isaac and his men were waiting. They ambushed the ambush. A grenade disabled the first speeder before it could even land. The second crashed into the wreckage, and before the mercenaries could react, Isaac and his 50 were on them. A firefight erupted. Plasma rounds lit up the streets, but Isaac moved like a ghost, rolling through cover, ripping weapons from hands, killing in close quarters with brutal efficiency. A merc tried to run, Isaac caught him, slammed him against a wall, and crushed his windpipe with a single punch. By the time it was over, no survivors remained. Isaac stood over the wreckage, scanning the bodies. Some bore Vorik's insignia. He turned to Rashek. Send a runner. Tell Vorik if he wants me dead, he can try himself. Rashek nodded, already barking orders. Isaac's lips curled into something cold and hungry. He wasn't playing defense. He was going to hunt. That night, Vorik's men gathered at a stronghold on the edge of the city, expecting another wave of assassins. Instead, Isaac came personally. The first explosion took out the front gates. The second ripped through the armory. Isaac walked through the flames with a rifle in one hand and a blade in the other. His men followed, cutting through the panicked remains of Vorik's forces. Vorik himself tried to escape. Isaac caught him at the landing pad, ripped the gun from his hand, and threw him to the ground. The warlord spat blood, sneering up at him. You think you can rule, human? The others will. Isaac stomped on his wrist, shattering bone. I don't care. He raised his pistol and pulled the trigger. A single plasma round through the skull. Vorik's lieutenants surrendered immediately. Isaac exhaled, holstering his gun. Rashek stood beside him. 2 warlords remain. Shakar and Jekson. Isaac nodded. Then we keep going. Rashek hesitated. You're doing this backwards. Isaac smirked. Am I? You're supposed to consolidate power first. Defend your position. Isaac looked at the burning stronghold, at the bodies of Vorik's men, at the survivors kneeling in submission. I don't need to defend anything. He turned, walking back toward the city. They're the ones who need to defend themselves. Shakar and Jekson would come for him. He would bury them too. And by the time the Galactic Council realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop him. Because Jucker 7 was already his. The war started before dawn. Shakar's forces moved fast, launching a coordinated assault on Bloodspike Bar, believing they could catch the new warlord before he solidified his power. It was a good plan. On paper. Reality didn't care about their plans. Isaac saw it coming before it started, the shifting underworld currents, the sudden silence in back alley deals, the way mercenaries stopped making eye contact when he walked by. He knew fear. He knew what desperation looked like in men who'd spent their lives killing for a paycheck. So when the first plasma mortars rained from the sky, Bloodspike Bar was already empty. Isaac had moved his people the night before. Shakar's men stormed in, finding only silence and corpses that weren't fresh. Confusion spread through their ranks, a slow-growing unease as they realized the killers they were expecting weren't there. Isaac's voice crackled through a hacked comm. You should have sent more men. And then the explosives went off. The entire district erupted. Rig charges turned buildings into firestorms, cutting off every escape route. The enemy force, hundreds strong, was suddenly trapped inside a ring of fire. And Isaac was already inside it with them. The first shots came from above. Snipers on rooftops, cutting through the panicking mercenaries as they scrambled for cover. Then the ground teams moved in. Isaac led the charge, rifle raised, cutting through Shakar's elite like a force of nature. A mercenary turned, panicked, plasma blade raised. Isaac caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his own knife through his throat. Another lunged from behind, but Isaac was faster, spinning and blasting 2 rounds into the attacker's skull before he hit the ground. The battle wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Shakar's forces tried to regroup, but Isaac was already inside their ranks, moving through them like death incarnate. One by one, they fell, cut down, broken, erased. And in the middle of it all, Shakar watched his army collapse. He had underestimated the human. He had thought the stories were exaggerated. Now he understood. Isaac didn't fight like the warlords of Jucker 7. He didn't fight for dominance or cruelty. He fought like a man who had already survived the worst war imaginable. And he fought like he wasn't afraid to die. Shakar tried to run. He sprinted through the burning ruins, trying to reach his last transport, lungs burning with every breath. His guards, what remained of them, formed a desperate wall between him and the advancing enemy. Isaac didn't slow down. He tore through them like they weren't even there. The first got a rifle butt to the jaw, the second lost his arm to a combat knife, the third barely raised his weapon before Isaac emptied a plasma round into his chest. Now there was nothing between them. Shakar stood alone. The flames cast long shadows, his breath ragged, his weapon shaking in his grip. Isaac didn't raise his gun. He stalked forward, step by step, his gaze unreadable. Shakar fired first. A desperate shot, too wild, too rushed. Isaac sidestepped, closed the distance, and wrenched the gun from his hands. A brutal punch to the ribs dropped Shakar to his knees. He gasped, clutching his side, eyes flickering up in horror. Isaac grabbed him by the collar, hauling him close. "Tell me something," Isaac said, voice calm. "Did you think this was going to end any other way?" Shakar coughed blood. You can't win. Isaac drove a knee into his gut, cutting off the words. Shakar collapsed, coughing, trembling. "You talk too much." Isaac drew his pistol, leveled it at Shakar's head, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the ruins. The last warlord of Jucker 7 was dead. The last true threat to his rule was gone. Isaac stepped over the body, holstering his weapon. The fires still burned, but the battle was over. Jucker 7 belonged to him. Rashek approached from the rubble, his armor scorched, his expression unreadable. "It's done." Isaac exhaled. He looked at the survivors, the mercenaries who had surrendered, the soldiers who had fought for him and lived. He turned to them, voice cold, unwavering. "You all have a choice," he said. "Swear loyalty, or leave this world forever." There was no hesitation. One by one, they knelt. Isaac watched, silent. Then he spoke again. "Good." He turned toward the city. "Then let's get to work." Jucker 7 had a new warlord. And soon, the rest of the galaxy would know it too. The moment the message reached the Galactic Council, they responded the only way they knew how, with overwhelming force. A fleet of 3,000 ships arrived in Jucker 7's orbit, blotting out the sky like a storm of fire and steel. The Council had no interest in negotiations. They weren't here to talk. They were here to exterminate. Isaac stood atop the balcony of his newly claimed fortress, watching the sky as the first wave descended. Dropships, heavy bombers, orbital artillery priming their cannons. The message was clear. They were here to make an example out of him. Rashek stood at his side, jaw clenched. "We can't fight that." Isaac exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "We don't need to." Rashek's brow furrowed. "We're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Isaac smirked. "Then it's a fair fight." The first bombardment came fast. A streak of plasma fire, hot as a dying star, ripped through the sky toward the fortress. The ground trembled as the city's outer defenses lit up in response, intercepting the first salvo with anti-orbital cannons hidden beneath the streets. The fleet commander's voice crackled through an open broadcast. A warning. Human warlord, surrender now, and we will grant you a swift death. Isaac grabbed the comm, switched it to a direct line, and replied with nothing but a dry chuckle. You should have sent more ships. The next bombardment came twice as hard. Isaac's forces held steady as the first wave of enemy dropships descended into the city. He watched as the enemy deployed thousands of elite soldiers, each one armed with Council-tier weaponry, cybernetic enhancements, and powered armor. Rashek stiffened. They sent the Black Legion. Isaac wiped a thumb across his chin. Fancy name for a bunch of dead men. The Legion advanced with military precision, pushing into the lower levels of the city, their forces fanning out like a machine. Isaac let them come. They had no idea they were walking into a graveyard. The moment the enemy reached the center of the fortified streets, Isaac gave the signal. The entire city ignited. Rigged explosives detonated beneath the pavement, collapsing entire blocks into molten ruin. Plasma turrets, automated drone swarms, and hidden artillery positions opened fire, turning the city into a battlefield designed to kill. Isaac moved with surgical brutality, cutting through their ranks like a blade through bone. An enemy soldier charged, his armor thrumming with an energy shield, a perfect defense, supposedly impenetrable. Isaac disagreed. He caught the soldier's wrist, twisted the arm out of its socket, and plunged a blade through the gap in the armor, severing the spinal link that controlled the exosuit. The body collapsed, lifeless before it hit the ground. Another came from behind. Isaac ducked beneath a plasma strike, grabbed the soldier's helmet, and slammed his head into a steel support beam. One by one, they fell. Rashek fought beside him, efficient and brutal. The rest of Isaac's men pushed back against the invasion, turning the Council's elite into corpses. But the battle was far from over. Isaac wiped blood from his knuckles, watching the second wave descend from orbit. Rashek's breath was ragged. This won't stop. They'll keep sending more. Isaac nodded. Then we take the fight to them. Rashek hesitated. You want to attack the fleet? Isaac grinned. I want to steal it. The plan was insane. That didn't mean it wouldn't work. Isaac and his strike team hijacked an enemy gunship, carving through the remaining ground forces and launching toward orbit. The Council fleet didn't expect resistance at this level. Their defenses were focused on planetary bombardment, not an assault from below. That mistake cost them everything. Isaac's team breached the flagship's hangar, cutting through resistance like a storm of death. The halls ran red as they pushed toward the command deck, eliminating officers, hacking into the ship's control systems, taking the bridge. Isaac grabbed the fleet commander by the collar and threw him against the console. The commander gasped, blood leaking from his mouth. You can't win. Isaac leaned in, his voice low. I already did. With a press of a button, he turned the Council's own fleet against itself. The orbital cannons redirected their fire, tearing through the other warships. The chaos spread instantly, as captains turned on one another, unsure who was compromised. By the time the Council realized what was happening, half their fleet was already in ruins. Isaac didn't wait. He took the flagship for himself, set its new course, and turned to Rashek. We're not just warlords anymore. Rashek met his gaze, realization dawning. Then what are we? Isaac smirked. Something worse. The fleet belonged to him now. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council's armada was in shambles. What was supposed to be a decisive execution had turned into a massacre of their own making. Isaac stood on the command deck of the stolen flagship, surrounded by shattered bodies and flickering control panels, watching as the fleet tore itself apart in the vacuum of space. The Council commanders panicked, broadcasting desperate distress signals to ships that no longer had captains to answer them. Plasma explosions bloomed across the void as their own automated defenses, overridden by Isaac's men, turned gunfire inward. Isaac exhaled slowly, resting a hand against the blood-slicked console, letting the weight of it all sink in. The Galactic Council had tried to wipe him out. Now their own fleet was under his command. Rashek stood at his side, eyes locked on the battle unfolding outside. They'll send reinforcements. Isaac rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers. Good. Let them. A chime cut through the comms, a desperate, high-ranking voice. This is Admiral Verax of the Galactic Council Defense Corps. Cease your attacks immediately. We are willing to negotiate terms. Isaac chuckled, shaking his head. Terms? He leaned into the console, his voice calm, almost amused. You don't get terms. The Admiral hesitated. There is no way out of this for you. Even if you win today, the full might of the Council will come for you. We have millions of ships, billions of soldiers. You cannot stand against the entire galaxy. Isaac rubbed his temple. You don't get it, do you? He sighed, voice turning sharp. You people look at me like I'm some warlord, another name on your list to erase. But you failed. And that failure just changed everything. The Admiral's voice grew more desperate. We can still make a deal. Isaac chuckled. I already have everything I need. With one flick of his fingers, he cut the transmission. The fleet was fractured, vulnerable, ripe for the taking. Isaac turned to Rashek. Patch me through to all surviving Council ships. Rashek gave a curt nod, working the controls. A second later, the remaining fleet captains, those who had yet to be destroyed, appeared across the bridge's holographic display. Isaac let them sit in their own silence, their fear palpable even across the void. I'm giving you one chance, Isaac said. You can stay loyal to the Council, die with them, burn with them. Or you switch sides and live. One by one, captains looked at their dwindling forces, their ruined command structure. One by one, they switched allegiance. Isaac nodded. Smart choice. The moment their transponders changed, the battlefield shifted. What remained of the Council's once mighty fleet was now under Isaac's command. The reality sank in. Isaac was no longer just a warlord. He had just taken an armada. Rashek exhaled, rubbing his jaw. We're about to become the single biggest threat to galactic power. Isaac smirked. We already are. A new message flashed across the console. A signal from the Galactic Council's High Command, urgent, direct. They're scared, Rashek muttered. Isaac's fingers hovered over the console. Good. He opened the transmission. A hologram snapped into existence, revealing High Chancellor Threxus, the most powerful man in the known galaxy. His features were tight, his usual composed arrogance cracked at the edges. Isaac Vale, the Chancellor said. You have no idea what you've just done. Isaac took a slow breath, eyes locked on the man who had just sent an armada to exterminate him. Oh, I know exactly what I've done. He gestured toward the burning ships outside. I just tore your leash off. The Chancellor's nostrils flared. You are a rogue element, nothing more. The full might of the Galactic Council will crush you. Isaac scoffed. That's funny. Because from where I'm standing, I'm the one with the fleet now. He took a step closer to the hologram, voice turning cold, dangerous. You thought you could wipe me out, erase me before I even mattered. But now? He leaned in, whispering, letting the weight of his words sink in. You started a war you can't win. The Chancellor's jaw clenched. If you take this path, there will be no turning back. Isaac smiled. I don't intend to turn back. With one final glance at the burning fleet outside, he cut the transmission. Rashek inhaled. What now? Isaac looked at the remains of the Council's fleet, now his fleet. At the kneeling captains. At the entire galaxy, standing on the brink of a new war. Now, the Council had something to fear. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Now? He smiled. We take everything.